Thank you so much, Rasika, for that introduction and for putting together this impressive series from which I've already learned a lot. I want to be clear that my talk is going to be primarily an ethnographic case study, not terribly theoretical, although I think many connections could be made between this case and the theoretical perspectives outlined in the series thus far, especially considering Wilkerson's analysis of race in America as a caste system and her reliance on Ambedkar in her work. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes and I'll have some musical examples I can share. First, a little bit of geographic and historical contextualization. So let me share my screen. Okay, so Richmond is an hour-and-a-half drive south of Washington, D.C. It was the historic capital of the slaveholding Confederacy. And it was not until this year that many of the monuments to the Confederacy were finally removed in this majority Black town. So in this presentation, I described music as ethics in the Richmond, Virginia City Jail. Music's role in the institution changed in late 2014 when residents were transferred from the old Richmond City Jail, that I'm going to call the RCJ, to a new facility, the Richmond City Justice Center, the RCJC, built adjacent to the old RCJ. The studio program I established in 2013 in the old jail was allowed to continue in the RCJC, but access was tightly restricted to a select population. In September 2018, as I was heading in for the weekly Friday session, I received a call from a staff member tasked with managing the studio. He said, "Andy, we got to shut it down again. The guys screwed up." What was it this time? Since moving to the RCJC, disciplinary problems occasionally prompted staff to suspend the program, usually for a couple of weeks or a month. These problems always fell into one of two categories, which the staff referred to as cash or carrots. Cash problems emerged when residents began to treat their music as a commodity, as a thing that they could own and had individual rights over, rather than as a therapeutic activity. This led to arguments over ownership and authorship. Carrot problems emerged when residents began to surreptitiously expand access to the studio beyond those on the officially approved list, sneaking friends in when deputies weren't looking, thereby circumventing the system of sticks and carrots used to control resident behavior. This week it was carrots. The community that met regularly in the basement education room in the old RCJ, prior to the move to the RCJC, called itself the Sanctuary, a group of around 50 residents who met to write poetry, make music, study, or just hang out. The valuation and exchange of music in the Sanctuary was often subverted to the ethical norms articulated by this semi-stable community. The ethical meaning and value of music became more ambiguous following the dissolution of the Sanctuary community after residents were moved to the RCJC. Despite these changes, music was in both institutions primarily a practice through which to declare and exercise modes of freedom within the strict constraints of incarceration. Residents regularly describe two types of atmospheres that they experienced in the jail. What I call carceral atmospheres were the heavy jail vibe that residents associated with the experience of objectification in carceral institutions. Liberatory atmospheres entailed experiencing oneself and life as an open-ended process. Music is an especially powerful mode for cultivating group experiences of open possibility that reject objectification. In the jail, liberatory atmospheres were associated with an ethics of sincerity that cultivated virtues of honesty, trust, and acknowledged dependence, as opposed to the ethics of capitalist individualism inculcated by the institution's drug recovery programs. I conclude this presentation by describing the perennial efforts to monetize music produced in the RCJC and the resultant disruption and dissolution of the communities that formed around the music program. Conceiving of music as individual property sometimes interrupted its ethical potential for catalyzing new communities. So a little background on incarceration in the United States. The Contemporary American Jail is a municipal or county institution that houses inmates held for sentencing and those convicted of misdemeanors, crimes punishable by a maximum of 1 year of incarceration. Prisons are federal or state institutions designed to house convicted felons serving multi-year sentences. As compared to prisons, many more people, up to 30 times more, pass through America's jails. Every year, nearly 1 million people enter the nation's 3,000 jails, and every year, nearly 1 million leave, either re-entering society or moving on to prisons. Entire segments of the American population have become habituated to mass incarceration as a permanent fact of life. In many communities in Virginia, the local jail is deeply integrated with policing, courts, parole systems, municipal funding streams, immigration enforcement, hospitals, and schools. Although largely invisible to large segments of society, the jail is a core social institution in the contemporary United States. The old RCJ was built in the mid-1960s to alleviate overcrowding in the small municipal jail and the notorious Virginia State Penitentiary on Spring Street that was originally built in 1796. Designed to house 800 residents, by 2005, the RCJ's population hovered around 1,400 due to higher arrest rates, the addition of temporary immigration detainees, and a policy of housing felons unable to be accommodated within the crowded state prison system. This gives you a sense of the overcrowding at that time. In 2016, Richmond's overall poverty rate was 25% against a 13% national average, but the poverty rate in the neighborhoods that many of the jail residents grew up in was around 60%. In 2015, Richmond was 50% Black and 45% white, while the male population of the jail, 90% of the total, was 87% Black with a 6th grade average education. My observations in the Richmond jail conform to Irwin's description of jails as a particular kind of social tool rather than an effective deterrent for serious crime. Its residents were primarily refugees of job precarity and dispossession. Many were addicts or had mental disabilities. The RCJ was built in the same era and immediately adjacent to the low-income housing intended for Black communities displaced when the construction of Interstate 95, a large highway, in the late 1950s destroyed their historic neighborhoods and business centers, primarily in the Jackson Ward area. Built atop the ruins of slave shacks and down the street from the notorious Lumpkin slave jail, the Richmond City Jail is located at the nexus of African-American dispossession in the former capital of the Confederacy. In their conversation, poetry, and song, many residents referred to the jail as a housing program. Whereas social control in Western antiquity was achieved through the omnipresent threat of death through capital punishment, social control in contemporary America is primarily achieved through the hyper-regulation of life, described by Foucault's concept of biopolitics. Biopolitical management is achieved through the internal subjectification of external means of control. Others have called this process self-discipline or self-objectification. In everyday life in America, this is often framed in terms of personal responsibility. But mass incarceration in America represents a more tyrannical and concrete form of social control. It relies both on the interiorization of neoliberal ethics, primarily the illusion of absolute self-sufficiency, which I describe below, and the physical control of bodies through surveillance and force. The experience of music as ethics in jails and prisons is directly related to the ambivalent status of the prisoner's life. This explained by Agamben's distinction between the ancient Greek concepts of zoe and bios. Zoe is bare life, the simple fact of living common to all living beings. Bios is the form of life associated with political and social existence. In America, incarceration is a form of banishment from the broader political community. While prisoners lack the rights and expectations we associate with social and political life in a commonwealth, and Virginia is a commonwealth, they are still biologically alive. And although their lives appear intimately bounded by the letter of the law, they have been abandoned by it. Consider the systematic and legal denial of full human life, bios, to many American Black men who are disproportionately targeted beginning early in life for incarceration, disproportionately experience police violence, health problems, lower life expectancy, and are disproportionately denied educational, political, and employment opportunities. Incarcerated Black men in America have been legally stripped of full humanity as community, bios, and are apparently possessed only of bare life, Zoe. In the jail, music affords opportunities for communal organization and expression, the opportunity to act as political beings and to recognize and be recognized. Music in this context can be a powerful expression of bios. It is an ethical good in this context because, in the words of one resident, it's rehumanizing. Okay. When I first visited it in 2013, the city jail was a crumbling brick building enveloped in razor wire. The city government allowed the RCJ to fall into disrepair during the construction of the new facility next door. When entering the building, visitors passed through an old metal detector before proceeding to a molded plastic bench in the cramped waiting area. Although this area was at ground level, I often felt as if I was deep underground. The heavy thud of large metal doors swinging shut, of men walking in line, the constant clanging of Joliet keys and chains. Some men at that time were still placed in leg chains. Large, loud fans, there was no air conditioning, unending chatter and shouting all combined into a constant dull roar. Only the mess hall was consistently quiet. Its metal tables and chairs were bolted to the floor in rows like pews, facing forward to a sign on the wall that read, "No loud talking," with the word loud scratched out. Residents in the RCJ lived in communal tiers rather than cells. Pairs of residents were assigned to bunk beds, sometimes with the third person sleeping on a mattress. You saw this here. The tiers were acoustically open spaces with several barred windows opening to the exterior and a long barred wall opening to an internal hallway, allowing residents in different tiers to communicate through the space. During my visits, the education director would lead me through a series of barred doors into the facility's basement before reaching the heavy door that opened into the narrow education room that residents called the sanctuary. This space was crammed with bookshelves and outmoded computers, its walls covered in poetry, artwork, collage, and photographs. Besides offering high school equivalency programs and workplace certifications, the sanctuary hosted workshops in drawing, yoga, Zen, meditation, poetry, and sponsored a documentary and lecture series. These perks seemed to bewilder and annoy staff who viewed the function of incarceration as punitive rather than rehabilitative. The sanctuary community established an ethical life of its own, distinct from rules and control of the official administration. In most carceral contexts, there are two somewhat independent ethical systems, norms that the residents themselves establish and the rules imposed by the institution and state. In many jails and prisons, it can be very difficult for new residents to know what is right or wrong in the eyes of the administration, yet they may be punished for infractions nevertheless. The confusing and constantly shifting list of rules, guidelines, and policies at the Richmond City Jail meant that violence and punishment are law. This is a Kafkaesque world in which minor gestures or forgetfulness can bring extreme consequences. So for instance, officially, I'm not allowed to physically touch any of the residents and should remain at a distance of 5 feet between myself and any resident. But this is physically impossible in the jail's crowded spaces. Black residents express their equality and humanity amongst themselves and their appreciation of my time through elaborate dap handshakes. And we know that if it wants, the administration can punish both residents and volunteers for such interactions. Swearing is officially disallowed, but everyone knows that it's crucial to hip hop, so it's generally, but not always, allowed in the music studio. Allowing swearing in music is part of this complex economy of carrots and sticks, regulating interactions between residents and staff. But official rules can always shift without warning, and so engaging in these activities always carried some level of risk. Because it incorporated easy-to-learn music software preloaded with hundreds of samples, loops, and beats, the Sanctuary Studio provided a musical outlet to a wide community, beyond those with technical training in instrumental performance or singing. Very few Black residents had ever participated in school music programs or received formal music lessons. A higher percentage of white men had basic guitar or keyboard skills. But by December 2013, the community had overloaded its hard drive with music and had collaboratively drafted a music manifesto that outlined their shared intentions and differentiated their musical activities from their active poetry program. I'll let you read that while I drink some water. For sanctuary members, entering the jail often entailed a separation from communities associated with gangs, prostitution, and drugs. Despite their violent, abusive, and dangerous nature, these were communities nonetheless. The sanctuary offered the opportunity for positive community in an otherwise deeply alienating environment. And within this context, music appeared to afford special forms of community making that other forms of expression could not. According to the education director, things residents won't talk about, they will sing about. Many of the most popular tracks produced in the sanctuary embodied a political theory for imagining social alternatives in future communities. A Dream and A Diamond in the Rough were two of the most popular tracks in this vein. In both, sanctuary members rap about the precariousness of life in the urban ghetto and challenge the generalized social weakness and moral inferiority that the criminal justice assigns to them. In their lyrics, they struggle to maintain a vision of a true community in the face of the fatalism many have developed as a coping mechanism on the outside. In A Dream, the artist considers the ambiguous aftermath of the civil rights movement, suggesting that American society is not a true democracy. He appeals for reconciliation between Christianity and Islam, a fraught proposal within the context of tensions in American jails between Christian-themed recovery programs and the Nation of Islam. In A Diamond in the Rough, another resident riffs on the ways in which incarceration modulates an inmate's sense of time, the ways in which time may seem to slow, stop, or even move backwards in the jail. He likens the bunk beds on the tiers to the blocks of public housing projects, Project Mattress. He portrays contemporary politicized racial tensions as a regressive rewinding of civil rights era gains as seen in police violence and changes to voting policy. These two pieces were composed in 2014, before the police killings of many more Black men and women that precipitated the riots of 2020. For the philosopher Ernst Bloch, music represented the most potent vehicle for communicating and anticipating an ethical community, a concrete utopia, as opposed to the merely wishful and playful abstract utopias of social theorists and novelists. He sounds kind of biased, but I agree with him. Within incarcerated contexts, music can embody an anticipatory consciousness of possible concrete utopias. More than compensation for present injustices, Bloch argued that music can catalyze new communities that enact shared ethics based upon a common good. For a time, the sanctuary in the old RCJ appeared to realize such an anticipatory consciousness. Its artists and musicians educated sanctuary members to desire and demand more and better from their world, a world in which value itself was reimagined. Writing within the monastic context, Thomas Merton argued that full personhood, again, Agamben's bios, demands the freedom to give oneself fully to one's community. In the jail, music represented one of the few contexts through which to express that freedom. But music was also a means through which to demonstrate forms of self-discipline, self-reform, and self-inspection. When residents sang and rapped about getting straight, getting independent, being on their own, going to work on time, getting checks, as opposed, so you get checks from formal employment, and that's opposed to getting paper, cash, derived from illicit economies. They demonstrated their internalization of virtues of self-sufficiency demanded by the jail administration and society at large. In their lyrics, many worked out the double bind that society holds out to them that they cannot not want a job that they cannot find anyway. Through poetry, lyrics, and the creeds uttered in recovery programs, residents performed this self-objectification demanded by life on the outside, demonstrating their preparedness for mainstream freedom and redemption back into capitalism. The music program is part of a larger musical economy in the jail. Independent of the mainstream market, we might naively assume that music in incarcerated contexts recaptures some imagined pure pre-commoditized authenticity. Although largely detached from its potential as intellectual property, music in the jail retained exchange value and could be traded for social stability, valuable objects from the canteen, or services such as protection. Residents with electronic skills repaired headphones and radios, selling or renting them for other objects or to pay off gambling debts. Participants could earn extra time in the studio to prepare for performing music in events such as the annual father-daughter dance, graduation ceremonies in the education program, talent shows, media projects, and weekly religious services. Through their performance at the semi-annual jail talent show, residents could win coveted jobs within the jail services sector. I'll say I had nothing to do with that administrative part of it. And if people have questions about how that was managed, we can talk about that later. Many residents who did not land official work assignments, which made doing time easier, used music as something to work on. The experience of music as ethics in the jail shifts as music crosses economic categories of use, barter, and gift. Gifts are officially prohibited in the jail because of their potential to form special relationships that could become problematic for the administration. If residents can organize for benign relationships and activities, the reasoning went, then they can organize for relationships and activities that would be problematic for the staff, such as labor unions. But because it was, according to one staff member, only sound, gifts could be given in the music program in the form of bars, that is a certain number of measures over which to rap over another's beat, lyrics, or in other forms of collaboration and services, such as mixing another's track. Okay, the Richmond City Justice Center. Hello. There we go. In response to a Center for Disease Control report suggesting that overcrowding in the old RCJ represented an existential threat to its population, the city approved the construction of a cutting-edge new facility, the Richmond City Justice Center, in 2011. Prior to the move into the new space in late 2014, residents expressed their anxiety and fears at the potential loss of the sanctuary. The track No Just Us summarized the community's concerns. Playing on the sonic similarity between justice and just us, the artist binds the sanctuary community to the shared pain of incarceration and the contradictions between rhetoric and reality.
I can feel the wind blow, bouncing off bricks and through the window. I feel the breeze through my sheets. It sparks thoughts I can't let go. Thoughts of this new jail, where you won't feel the wind no more. They're calling it the Justice Center. And to everyone that don't know yet, there won't be no just us in it. It'll be just us in it. Inmates, residents, or tenants, whatever you call them. White, black, brown, men and women who 9/10 of didn't get a proper defense of their cases because of overworked public defenders who can't even remember their faces. And we are told to obey laws that are so.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going. The RCJC, built adjacent to the old RCJ and designed to accommodate 1,300 residents, replaced overcrowded tier housing with several triangular behavior modification pods, staffed by a deputy at a touchscreen, often remotely. The RCJC is a properly neoliberal facility shaped by the massive changes in technology, society, labor, and incarceration America has experienced since the old RCJ was constructed in the 60s. New technologies in the facility mirror the increased social panopticism of outside life described by the sociologist Louis Lacan as a society of continual and perpetual punitive surveillance, in which there's been a blurring between law enforcement, urban planning, and architecture. The RCJC's shining lobby features large flat screen monitors, often playing police procedural dramas such as CSI, and is virtually indistinguishable from a contemporary American airport terminal. All spaces are continually monitored through video and audio surveillance devices, data from which is stored on hard drive. So this is what visitation looked like in the old RCJ. That's what it looks like now. Staff members were unsure exactly how many cameras were in the facility. Many agreed that the number was between 800 to 900. Residents and staff believed the surveillance system employed software running behavior matching algorithms. Although I was unable to verify these claims, the belief that such technology is in place accomplishes the same objective of self-surveillance. As in many overcrowded prisons, it was nearly impossible for staff to maintain consistent and total control in the densely populated Richmond Jail. Instead, a kind of truce is realized based upon everyone's understanding that violent disruption would not be in anyone's interest. A truce requires a constant negotiation in a shifting economy of power. In the jail, access to music became one of the many carrots exchanged for predictable, manageable behavior. In the RCJC, the studio program sometimes became entangled in the complex choreography of sentencing, recovery, and good behavior. This was not a clearly rule-based dynamic, but one that encouraged residents to engage in complex head games and rhetorics of professed change. Within the economy of good behavior, the administration could hoard the value of the audio program by restricting access. Such carrots were especially tempting for residents awaiting sentencing, knowing that staff might be willing to vouch for their good behavior in court, potentially leading to reduced terms. Participants in the music program might be highly motivated to produce music that pleased the administration. Okay, I'm going to move to this concept of atmospheres. Following the move to the RCJC in 2014, we installed the music studio in the new education room on the 6th or recovery floor. From their position behind the microphone, residents would look out the windows over the Shockoe Bottom area of the city, a floodplain for the adjacent James River. 160 years ago, this area was home to the second largest slave market in the world, second only to New Orleans, which bought many of its slaves from Richmond. Looking to the south, residents could see the site of the infamous Lumpkin slave jail. The RCJC had been constructed on the site of former slave shacks, and looking to the east, residents could see one of the many low-income housing developments built in the 60s to manage African-American communities displaced by the construction of I-95. Many of its residents hailed from these ghettos. The sounds of traffic, police sirens, and trains wafting up from Shockoe Bottom could faintly be heard through the facility's sealed external windows. Gunfire was occasionally heard from the direction of the ghettos. Directly above them, mounted in the ceiling of the studio, residents at the microphone could see one of the ubiquitous surveillance units installed throughout the facility. These included a camera, a microphone, and a small red LED light that some residents called the Eye. These units, in addition to a speaker, were installed in each cell, allowing staff sitting at a computer on another floor to surveil and regulate residents. According to several residents, the atmosphere of the studio space, quote, interrupted their flow when they attempted to record their music. They couldn't get into the beat, and they asked if we could find an alternate space for the studio. A sympathetic staff member located a small unused office space separated from the loud hallway by an intermediate room. The new space didn't have any windows or, as far as we could tell, any surveillance devices. External sounds were strongly muted by the thick walls. To me, this tight cinder block square seemed at first to be a suffocating, alienating space, but for many of the residents, it became this space often infused with a magical atmosphere in which they could lay down their tracks free of interruption and surveillance. This space fostered atmospheres in which residents could explore new social and creative possibilities. The colloquial English term atmosphere typically describes the sense of a shared feeling in a particular time and place. That understanding largely overlaps with my use of the term here. While jail residents likely experienced many kinds of atmospheres during their incarceration, they described to me two primary types, which I describe as carceral atmospheres and liberatory atmospheres. For many residents, music could model ethical social interactions and was often associated with these liberatory atmospheres. I frequently heard participants describe the uplifting atmospheres that they experience in the studio as the antithesis of the heavy jail vibe that dominated their everyday experience of incarceration. Carceral atmospheres index a long history of racialized oppression involving the objectification of African-American lives to the status of mere bodies. Again, Agamben's Zoe. This includes the theft, enslavement, sale, commoditization of Black bodies, and the postbellum maintenance of a structural racialized underclass through Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, and police surveillance. As described by jail residents, carceral atmospheres produced the feeling of being a surveilled, controlled object whose future is predetermined. Many residents were told that tattooing was prohibited in the jail because it was a form of damaging state property. For many residents, the carceral atmosphere was associated with an ethic of responsibilization. This ethical regime encouraged self-surveillance and the understanding of oneself as a self-sufficient, self-maximizing individualist. Most members of the music program had a history of drug addiction and were enrolled in the jail's recovery programs. Although these programs bring their followers into a community of recovering addicts, they strongly emphasize personal responsibility and calling out one another's faults. Within the discourse of 12-step recovery, the individual must be abstracted from their environment, and addiction cannot be blamed on external environmental factors such as the family, society, or history. Recovery in this paradigm is possible only through a rigorously critical inventory of one's own moral defects and surrendering oneself to God, framed within an evangelical Christian context. In the RCJC, this program is supplemented by a text series entitled Recovery Without a Crutch, in which codependency, that is, depending on others, was targeted as a pathological behavior. The principles of 12-step recovery coincide with mainstream America's individualist and meritocratic ethos. In contemporary neoliberalism, this manifests as discourses of self-sufficiency in which dependence on others, the government, or communal cooperative organizations is viewed as lazy, uncreative, and parasitic. Responsibilization and self-sufficiency are demanded of the underclass by contemporary labor precarity, in which it is up to the individual, rather than to unions or government policy, to secure jobs, quality education, and social services. This suggests that poverty, ignorance, incarceration, or ill health is the result of one's essentially irresponsible nature, rather than historical and political processes that systematically disenfranchise particular groups. I'm going to move to the final section on owning music. Discussions about monetization of their music did not emerge in the old sanctuary as far as I could tell. The strong distinction between the sanctuary community and the exploitative behaviors associated with outside life expressed in their music and poetry likely dampened talk of monetizing the community's expressions. In the RCJC, by contrast, the issue emerged perennially and foretold the impending dissolution of the current community, each time followed by a hiatus and a subsequent period of gradual renewal with a new group of participants. This cycle occurred in roughly similar structure 4 times between 2015 and 2019. A cycle beginning in June 2016, when a young rapper organized a community of musicians on his pod to restart the studio, illustrates the salient features of this dynamic. Within 3 months of their initial meetings, the team had produced over 15 collaborative tracks. A member of the education staff often collaborated with the team in interactions that appeared mutually inspiring, genuine, and unforced. Most tracks included lyrics that residents categorized as uplifting, struggle stories, in which rappers described making it out of the projects and getting clean. The team performed many of these tracks for the recovery program talent shows and meetings. In the studio, they spoke positively about creating tracks that simultaneously satisfied the doctrines of the recovery program and their own aesthetic desires. For this team, many of the studio sessions catalyzed intense and euphoric liberatory atmospheres. But by September, the team realized that many of their tracks might be considered pro-level by outside standards. And in late October, they proposed creating a jail music label and coordinating with a local independent radio station to broadcast their music. Studio sessions began to include excited discussions of copyright and ownership and how to best manage collaborative licensing. By November, that euphoria had crashed to the ground as the members began to argue over ownership, copyright, and licensing. This interaction summed up a dynamic in which communities bound together by a shared experience of music as ethics were torn apart by attempts, or in one case, simply the discussion of the commoditization of music, revealing competing motivations and ethics. One resident described this as the tension between two common phrases used in residence rap. You feelin' it? As opposed to gots to get mines. The first phrase exhorted listeners to come together as a community entrained to a shared rhythm. The second phrase prioritized the individual's self-maximization at whatever cost. Sometimes residents spoke about music as a religion. Its value as a therapeutic and community-forming activity was above all price. Engaging music in this mode conferred some of its dignity to participants themselves. At other times, residents fantasized about making it in the music industry so that they would not have to resort to charity, welfare, family, selling drugs, or other forms of illicit hustling. The distinction between cash and carrot problems that I described at the beginning of the presentation symbolizes different and opposed ways in which residents imagined and shaped their community. Conceiving of music in terms of individual ownership and control, cash, recapitulated the neoliberal concept of the Commonwealth as a system that prioritizes the protection of personal property. Seeking to constantly broaden access to musical resources by sneaking friends into the studio, thereby circumventing one of the carrots staff could use to control resident behavior, was a form of imagining the Commonwealth as an ethical community in which individuals have broad and equal access to sonic resources and rights. In the sanctuary, musicians offered a sincere representation of oneself in exchange for being a member of the community. In the RCJC, violating the contractual terms of the exchange by, for instance, removing oneself from a track or by using another's beat without express written permission was unethical and dangerous. But I don't mean to overdraw these binaries. In both the sanctuary and the RCJC, music catalyzed intense liberatory atmospheres that shifted attention away from collective suffering to a sense of collective Black joy and the possibility that people like me might come to experience a deeper ethical awareness by listening closely to their music. So I'm going to play one last track. It was a track that many members of the studio associated with what I'm calling liberatory atmospheres, an example of what they felt to be good ethical music. But it's an interesting track because it actually combines this language of writing together, feeling music together, making it out of the projects together, but also with the tropes of individualism in the phrase "got to get mines." So I'll play a little bit of this, and then if folks have questions.
See, a lot of people can't stop hearing this. We put our mind to it, we put our mind to it. We stay focused. A lot of lonely nights out there. Yeah. Southside Courtney, straight from the bottom, made it from the bottom, now I'm all the way up. No more late nights posted in the cuts. Still roaming around, got the thing go tuck, and I don't get if it ain't all that, ain't nothing to discuss. She ain't really on the paper. Ride around slow, waving high to the haters. And my paper on the rise like it's on the elevator. Got the game, they don't know how to take us. On the grind, I gotta get mine. Can't let nothing keep me behind. On the grind, got to get mine. Ain't nobody gonna stop my shine. When they had me on the bottom, now I'm on feet, cause now it's your boy John Boy Sky, man. Yeah, everybody wanna ride out with me. See a hitter like me, straight from the bottom. Came a long way, I was hanging in the park. Came a long way, I was chasing dirty dogs on the grind, dollar sign. What your hater trying to stop me? Ain't get real, you don't really want the problem. Got some young hitters still hanging in the project. Mama told me get it, so I told her that I got it. A lot of people still hate because they'd rather see me stop. On the grind, I gotta get mine. Can't let nothing keep me behind. On the grind, got to get mine. Ain't nobody gonna stop my shine. When they had me on the bottom, now I'm on fleek, cause now I got them. Black wheel ball, man. Yeah. Everybody wanna ride out with me. Top now. all the way up like them rims and them tires on trucks, on straight out the mud. Still got that burp in my blood. Just off the four in my cup, all my hustles, what up? Made it out the projects. On the kitchen with the soda and the Pyrex. Trapped out, got some steel on the grind, yes. So I still got the thing in the black vest. I gotta get mad.
That's only the first half of the track. I'll stop there. Thank you. If you have any questions.